The 48th floor conference room of Halberton and Price was all glass and hauteur, sunlight spilling across polished mahogany and the Hudson River glittering like a backdrop to power. I'd been in this room more times than I could count over the last 17 years, but today, the air felt heavier. Clive Drexler leaned back in his leather chair, a half smile playing at his lips as if he were delivering a clever joke. Regarding your annual performance bonus, Clara, we've made an adjustment. His voice carried just enough to reach the dozen board members seated along the table's length. The numbers appeared on the screen, minus 20,000 from the figure I'd been promised. He tapped the page in front of him, like a magician revealing a final card. Given the scope of the firm's revenue, that's essentially a rounding error. A few chuckles rippled through the room. One director, Stanwyck, whose hands shook when he raised a glass, muttered to the woman beside him. Past her prime, they didn't bother lowering their voices. I kept my gaze on Clive, my expression a mask I'd perfected in boardrooms and courtrooms alike. Inside, the words burned. A rounding error. 17 years of salvaging portfolios, predicting market shocks, navigating political storms for clients who thought bonds were dull until they weren't compressed into a joke. When the meeting adjourned, I gathered my folder slowly, letting the leather hinge snap shut with a quiet finality. My heels clicked across the hardwood toward the elevator, the rhythm steady, deliberate. Halfway down the hall, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. My day had already been generous with insults, but curiosity won. If you want to get back at them, check the St. Albans redevelopment bond reports. No punctuation, no signature. I stopped walking. The glow of the screen reflected faintly in the glass wall beside me. St. Albans. The name tugged at something, an old file, buried in the archives of my memory. I slipped the phone back into my bag, my face still composed for the benefit of passing assistance. Inside, though, gears were shifting, aligning with a click I could almost hear. By the time the elevator doors opened, I'd already decided this wasn't over, not by a long shot. When I first walked into Halberton and Price in 2006, I was 27, armed with a secondhand briefcase and the kind of hunger that didn't fade after one win. My cubicle was tucked behind the elevator bank on the 32nd floor, and my first assignment was reconciling discrepancies in a bond portfolio, so neglected it still had paper certificates in the file drawers. I didn't just reconcile it, I found $1.3 million in unclaimed interest the firm didn't know it had. By 2012, I was a senior strategist, working late in a dimly lit office overlooking Wall Street when an alert flashed across my screen. The municipal bonds for Westwater County, valued at $60 million, were about to collapse under a bad refinancing deal. I ran the numbers twice, then again, then called a partner at midnight to halt the trade. By morning, the firm had avoided a disaster that would have splashed our name across every business page in the country. The partners sent champagne. Clive sent a terse email. Good work. That was his style, never too much credit to anyone who might someday be competition. 17 years later, I was still here. The titles had changed, the faces on the board rotated, but the hours, the fights, and the pressure were constants. What changed were the stakes. My father's medical bills, lingering like unpaid debts to a man who'd raised me alone, had shadowed my finances for years. That bonus was supposed to clear them, to let me breathe for the first time since I signed the hospice papers. Instead, I found myself thinking of something I hadn't touched in nearly a decade, the manila envelope in my home safe. My Uncle Raymond, a former banking lawyer, had left me $19 million in municipal debt instruments, all issued by Halberton and Price. Each carried a succession clause, a rare provision allowing early redemption if the issuer breached fiduciary duty. Back when I inherited them, I'd seen it as an oddity, a historical footnote, I told myself I'd never use them. They were a safety net, not a weapon. But safety nets can be repurposed when the fall is deliberate. Now, holding that insult from Clive in my mind, I wondered if my uncle had left me more than an inheritance. Maybe he'd left me the means to end a game I'd been forced to play for far too long. That night, I cleared the dining table and spread the St. Albans redevelopment bond reports across it, the pages fanning out like a crime scene waiting to be diagrammed. Numbers are rarely loud, but these screamed in their own way management fees well above state averages. Maturity dates stretched a decade past the original schedule. Interest accruals that would bleed the city long after the last ribbon cutting. I read them twice, making sure fatigue wasn't warping the figures. Then I pulled the portfolio index from my safe and began scanning line by line, midway through. My eyes froze on a code I recognized. A block of St. Albans bonds, Series 2015C, sat neatly in the middle of my inherited holdings. Face value just over $4 million. Issuer Halberton and Price. It wasn't just professional disgust I felt. Then it was the cold jolt of realizing that these bonds were tethered to me in a way that could be turned into leverage. The succession clause my uncle had insisted on wasn't just a curiosity anymore. It was a loaded trigger aimed directly at my own employer. I turned to public records, toggling between the city's debt disclosures and the firm's annual reports. The same pattern kept surfacing. Different cities, same playbook. Bayhaven's waterfront revitalization bonds carried inflated management fees eerily similar to St. Albans. Ridgemont's school infrastructure bonds had their repayment schedule extended by 9 years, without any public-facing justification. The repetition wasn't coincidence. It was method. Someone high enough in municipal strategy was baking inefficiency into every deal, ensuring the firm extracted maximum profit at the expense of the municipalities they were supposed to serve. By midnight, my table was a topography of paper stacks and annotated spreadsheets, arrows and notes crisscrossing in red ink. I sat back, my pen resting against my teeth, and let the shape of it settle in my mind. If St. Albans was compromised and my name was printed on the certificates they'd handed me, the perfect starting point. And if the same fingerprints were on Bayhaven and Ridgemont, there was no telling how many more cities were sitting on ticking debt bombs wearing our logo. The storage facility in Jersey City didn't look like much from the outside, just a squat concrete block with a loading dock and a keypad on the door, but it held decades of Halberton and Price's institutional memory. Contracts, closing documents, old prospectuses, the kind of paper trail that could either save a firm or sink it. I signed in under the guise of a routine compliance audit, my badge scanned by a bored clerk who barely looked up from his phone. The air inside was dry and faintly metallic, the hum of the overhead fluorescents constant as I made my way down the narrow aisles. Row after row of labeled boxes stood like patient sentinels, waiting for someone to ask the right question. I started with the St. Albans file, confirming the hard copies matched the digital ones I'd poured over the night before. They did down to the inflated fee schedules and the signatures authorizing them. I snapped photos with my phone, keeping the sound muted. Then I pulled the boxes for Bayhaven and Ridgemont. I told myself it was just to confirm my hunch, but the moment I flipped through the first contract, the déjà vu hit. Clauses modified post-approval, repayment terms stretched, interest rates adjusted upward without corresponding municipal benefit. It was like reading the same script, just with different city names. The Bayhaven bonds alone represented $8 million of my inherited holdings. Ridgemont's total came in at just under $5 million. Adding St. Albans, the questionable portion of my portfolio now sat at $26 million every dollar, backed by a succession clause and an obvious breach of fiduciary duty. I packed the files back exactly as I'd found them, aligning the edges until they looked untouched. walking out into the gray afternoon. The wind coming off the Hudson was sharp enough to sting my eyes. 3 cities, 3 patterns, 3 undeniable links to my inheritance. I'd come here to confirm a suspicion, but I was leaving with something far more potent, a case that could turn my uncle's dusty estate gift into a precision weapon aimed at the firm's most vulnerable point. The Regency's ballroom was all polished brass and low chatter, the kind of place where linen napkins seemed to carry more weight than some of the investment pitches being made. I took my seat near the back, close enough to observe without becoming part of the show. The luncheon was ostensibly about strengthening municipal investment relationships, but everyone knew it was a stage for Clive to parade his version of success. He worked the podium like he was born there, his tone smooth, his tie perfectly knotted. Slides of projected returns flashed on the screen behind him. Bay Haven, Ridgemont, St. Albans, all dressed up with optimistic growth curves that made my jaw tighten. I recognized every manipulated deal buried under those graphics. Midway through, Clive's smile sharpened. "Some people," he said, pacing the front of the stage, "think 20 grand matters." His eyes found mine across the room, holding just long enough to make sure the implication landed. The laugh from the audience was immediate, polite in tone, sharp in intent. A couple of investors leaned toward each other, murmuring, while one of the junior partners smirked openly. I kept my face neutral, my hands folded on the tablecloth, and let the heat of humiliation pass through me without showing in that moment. The decision that had been forming quietly in the back of my mind solidified into something immovable. This wasn't going to be about bruised pride or evening the score over a single insult. It wasn't even about my bonus anymore. It was about a system built to bleed the very municipalities it claimed to serve. About a leadership team so insulated from consequence that they could laugh at theft in a ballroom. I listened to the rest of his speech without hearing a word, my focus turning inward, toward the documents waiting in my apartment and the clauses buried in my inheritance. There was a way to do this to strip the rot without collapsing the entire structure on myself. I just needed precision, patience, and the right opening. When the applause came, I clapped twice, rose with the rest, and began drafting the first moves of a plan that would leave no room for their laughter. Patricia Voss's office sat 12 floors above Broadway, the kind of space where glass and steel met old money. She greeted me with a firm handshake and an expression that suggested she already knew this wasn't a casual consultation. I laid the portfolio summaries and municipal contracts across her desk, the red ink annotations standing out like wounds. She read silently, her eyes narrowing only when she reached the amended repayment schedules for St. Albans, Bay Haven, and Ridgemont. When she finally looked up, there was no trace of doubt. "These succession clauses," she said, tapping the bond certificates with her pen, "are airtight. If we can establish breach of fiduciary duty, Halberton and Price will be legally obligated to redeem them at face value, plus compounded interest and applicable penalties." I leaned forward. "What's the number?" She flipped through her notes, then met my gaze. Approximately $47 million. The figure sat between us, heavy and undeniable. 47 million, not a rounding error, but a crater in the middle of the firm's municipal division. Patricia's tone shifted, cooler now, deliberate. "Once we file, this becomes public record. The board, the regulators, the press, they'll all see it. There's no graceful way to step back once it's in motion, and they will come after you. Clara, hard." I thought about Clive's smirk in that ballroom, about the cities carrying debt they should have shed years ago, about my father's hospital bills folded into a drawer I still couldn't bring myself to open. "What happens if they can't pay?" I asked. "Emergency arbitration, asset liquidation, regulatory intervention. It will be ugly." She closed the folder gently, as if sealing the choice inside it. The question is whether you want to start a fight that can't be contained. I met her stare and felt the steadiness in my own voice. I'm not starting the fight. I'm just making sure it ends in the right place. Patricia's lips curved, not quite a smile, but close enough to signal we understood each other. She reached for her calendar, ready to set the first date. 2 mornings later, I sat at my kitchen counter with coffee cooling beside my laptop and reread the letter one last time. Notice of breach and redemption. Demand formal, precise, backed by 18 pages of supporting documentation. Every number, every clause, every instance of manipulated repayment terms was laid out like evidence in a trial. At 8:47 a.m., I attached the file to an email addressed to the CEO, the full board, and the head of municipal operations. I copied Patricia Voss and blind copied myself. Then I hit send. The satisfaction was quiet, almost clinical. No rush of adrenaline, just the awareness that a clock had started ticking 30 business days for them to find $47 million or face arbitration less than an hour later. My phone buzzed with an alert from the Financial Herald. The headline stopped me mid-sip: municipal bond mismanagement allegations rock Halberton and Price. I clicked through to find a redacted version of my dossier cities unnamed. Totals rounded, but the language unmistakable. Someone had handed the press just enough to stir speculation without burning the entire house down. My first instinct was to call Patricia, but another text flashed across the screen before I could. No name, no punctuation, just consider it an accelerant. The number was the same one that had buzzed my phone outside the boardroom after Clive's insult. I stared at it. The hum of the refrigerator suddenly loud in the stillness. This wasn't a coincidence. Whoever they were, they'd been nudging me toward this confrontation from the beginning, and now they were making sure it unfolded in public as well as behind closed doors. I slipped the phone into my pocket and opened the Herald article again, scanning for what wasn't there. No explicit mention of my name, no direct link to my holdings. The leak had been calculated, just like the message enough to rattle investors, to make the board sweat, but not enough to compromise my legal position. It was the kind of move I would have made myself if I'd had an insider feeding me the ammunition. By the time I stepped off the elevator at headquarters, the 48th floor didn't sound like the firm I'd known for 17 years. The usual low hum of market chatter was gone. Trading terminals glowed idly, abandoned mid-session. Legal had locked themselves in the North Conference Room, blinds drawn. Down the hall, Investor Relations was juggling 3 phone lines each, voices pitched high with the brittle edge of damage control. Through the glass of the executive suite, I caught flashes of movement: board members gesturing over spreadsheets, assistants darting in and out with printouts still warm from the copier. Everyone was in motion, but no one looked like they had a plan. Clive emerged from the far corner, flanked by 2 compliance staffers. His tie was loose, his smile thin. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "Clara, I need your badge and company devices, effective immediately. You're suspended pending investigation for breach of confidentiality." It was a bold play, reckless, even but not unexpected. The Financial Herald leak had rattled him, and I was the most obvious target to blame. I didn't argue. I pulled my phone from my bag, tapped the screen twice, and opened a new email. To Clive Drexler, CEO's office, full board distribution list, CC Patricia Voss. Subject line: notice of potential retaliation against protected activity. In the body, I wrote, "In light of my recent submission of a formal notice of breach and redemption demand under the municipal bond succession clauses, today's attempt to suspend me without stated evidence appears to constitute retaliation against lawful whistleblower activity. As you know, such action carries significant regulatory implications." I hit send before he could speak again. His jaw worked, but nothing came out. Around us. Conversation slowed. A few heads turned. Someone in investor relations stopped mid-sentence on a call. Patricia's reply hit my inbox within minutes. Received. Logged. Do not surrender any property without board directive. I slipped the phone back into my bag and walked past Clive toward my office, leaving him in the middle of the hallway, the eyes of half the floor on him. The club in Tribeca was a relic from another era, dark wood panels, brass fixtures polished to a dull glow, and the faint scent of cigars long since outlawed but still embedded in the fabric of the place. Elias Harrington was already seated at a corner table, a crystal tumbler of water untouched in front of him. He rose when I approached, shaking my hand with the sort of measured grip that said he never wasted more energy than necessary. "Clara," he said, as though we were old colleagues meeting for a routine catch-up, not the opening move in a high-stakes standoff. I didn't bother with small talk. "$47 million, I said, sliding a slim folder across the table. Structured as a strategic consulting arrangement over 5 years, Clive Drexler's resignation, effective immediately, and independent oversight on all municipal contracts, with quarterly reports to the board and regulators. His eyes skimmed the bullet points, expression unchanged, but I caught the slight tightening of his jaw at Clive's name. "That's ambitious," he said finally. "Not really. It's the minimum required to prevent arbitration hearings where your firm's practices get picked apart by people with subpoena power." I let the words hang, then added, "And it's the best option you'll get before investors start asking for a deeper house cleaning." I leaned back, watching him. "Besides," I said lightly, "you wouldn't want all your careful work to go to waste. The text, the leak, smart timing." His head tilted, a fraction too slow to be casual. "I don't know what you mean." "Of course not," I said, letting the hint of a smile cross my face. I didn't need to prove it. I only needed him to know that I knew. For the first time since I sat down. Elias looked directly at me, weighing the cost of denial against the risk of refusing me. His fingers tapped once on the folder before he closed it. "I'll take it to the board," he said. I nodded. "Do that. But remember, every hour you delay is another headline waiting to happen." The settlement came through faster than I'd expected. 6 days of negotiations, 3 conference calls, and 1 emergency board meeting that ended with Clive Drexler's resignation to pursue other opportunities. The official press release spoke of strategic restructuring and enhanced fiduciary commitments, but the subtext was clear. They'd capitulated. $47 million, paid over 5 years under the title of strategic consulting, independent oversight baked into every municipal contract, with quarterly reports sent directly to the board and regulatory agencies. For the first time in my career, the reforms I'd fought for weren't a side note, they were the structure. When the offer came to take over as full-time director of the municipal division, I didn't hesitate before saying no. I'd spent too many years watching good intentions corrode under fluorescent lights and endless meetings. Instead, I shaped the consulting arrangement to work 3 days a week, handpicking only the clients and projects that aligned with my standards. Freedom, not title, was the prize I'd been after all along. The day the final signatures dried, I left the office early. The sun was dipping low when I stepped onto the wooden planks of the Brooklyn Bridge, the air warm with the last hint of summer. To my left, Lower Manhattan's skyline gleamed in gold, glass catching the light like a city pretending it had no shadows. My phone buzzed, a single text from the same anonymous number that had started it all. "Debt paid. Keep asking the right questions." I stood there for a long moment, thumb resting on the screen, the wind tugging at my hair. I didn't reply. Whoever they were, they'd played their part, and I'd played mine. It struck me then this was never just about the 20,000 they tried to dismiss, or even the $47 million they ended up paying. It was about proving that patience, integrity, and the kind of experience they couldn't quantify on a spreadsheet would always outlast arrogance. The city lights began to flicker on, and I started walking again, the bridge stretching ahead like a quiet promise.